what I want us all to imagine is that we're actually in Readings Carlton. And what's happened is that we've walked through those glorious glass doors, and on either side of us are books. But more than that, on either side of us are ideas. And you head down to the back of the shop. Remember, bookcases, people browsing, people talking, and you find yourself a seat or a place to stand. You might lean against the bookshelves. And it is that moment that I come out to the microphone, the one and only microphone that Readings owns, and say, everyone, be quiet, be quiet. I've got such a tremendous conversation for you tonight. Hello, I would say. My name is Chris Gordon. I'm the programming manager for Readings, and I am delighted to be able to welcome you here on behalf of Readings, on behalf of HarperCollins. But before we get going, I want us all just to kind of take a little moment out of our extraordinarily busy lives to reflect that from wherever we've come from today, wherever we are in Australia, we're of course living on stolen ground, land that has not been ceded. It always seems to me that we're so fortunate to be able to have the stories and the songlines of the First Nations people just right there for us to learn, to reflect, to think all about what this glorious land has given us. At the moment, I'm speaking from the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respects and, more importantly, give my gratitude to their elders on behalf of all of you here, past, present, and emerging. It is a pleasure now to introduce you to a bloke that I've known for quite a few years now. And of course, I'm talking about the Managing Director of Readings, Mark Rubbo. I've been working with Mark for just a couple of years. That's all I'd like to say, Mark, just a couple of years. And I tell you that the conversations and the laughter that I've had over my time at Readings has had one of the most profound influences on my life. I know that tonight you are in such safe hands. And remember, we're in his shop. We're down the back there. We've got the bookcases on either side. People are quiet because they understand that they now need to listen. Mark, over to you. Oh my goodness, can you hear the applause?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you everyone for being here tonight. And I too would like to acknowledge that I'm talking from the Kulin Nation. I'm very grateful that the elders past and present have given me permission to be here tonight, and also acknowledge that we took their land and we've never acknowledged that properly in our country, and maybe Stan will touch on that tonight. But tonight we're talking with Stan Grant. All of you, I'm sure, know Stan. He's one of Australia's most respected journalists. He's a proud Wiradjuri man, and I suppose he really, with his talk that he gave in Sydney in 2015 about the experience of being an Aboriginal man, an Aboriginal person in Australia, went viral around the country and really helped galvanise what I hope, and I'm sure Stan hopes, is perhaps a slow changing of attitudes to how we look and feel about our First Nations people. So Stan, thank you so much for all you've done for us and for our country in that. But tonight, we're going to talk about Stan's new book, which is With the Falling of the Dusk. This is a very, very powerful book. I suppose, Stan, it draws on your experiences as a respected journalist. You worked in some very, very tight spots, China, Afghanistan, Pakistan, South Africa, and these have led you, I guess, to think about how you see the world. The title itself, With the Falling of the Dusk, is an intriguing one. Perhaps you could tell us where that came from and give us a little bit of insight about that.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for everyone coming along tonight virtually. I wish I was able to be there and see you all, but we're able to share in this moment. And I'm really deeply appreciative of everybody who has tuned into this tonight and taken the time to be involved in this conversation. And again, to my respects to the people of the Kulin Nation, respects to Indigenous peoples everywhere, wherever you're watching this tonight, wherever you're joining us from. You are on the land of First Nations people. And for me, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I am here in Sydney, and of course, in my heart, my Wiradjuri family and my Gamilaroi family. So I want to pay all respects to my people tonight, and you as well for joining us. That title with the falling of the dusk, Mark, it really does frame the book. It's taken from something that Hegel, the German philosopher, once said, and he said that the owl of Minerva spreads its wings with the falling of the dusk. It's a beautifully poetic phrase which captures how we gain wisdom only in hindsight, only after we've seen where we have come. But more than that, he counseled us that we failed to learn from that wisdom, and that the pursuit of freedom, the pursuit of utopian ideas of how to manage or govern society, of how to rule over people, of how to order society, in whatever form that may take, can put us on, in one of his phrases, the highway of despair. And so I took that title with the falling of the dusk to sort of contemplate this moment that we're at and reflect on the journey of my life and my reporting, and also to peel back and look at the philosophical ideas that have animated our world, the political ideas, the cataclysmic events that I've seen and the events that preceded me. And to do all of that through the eyes of someone whose family and whose ancestors have endured our own apocalypse with invasion and the theft of land and genocide. And so I think it's my journey into this world, looking through my eyes at what I've seen: China, North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, right throughout the Middle East, right throughout Europe, Africa, and looking at that other side of history, that world that is not the world of the West, but lives in a world that the West has made, and where those fault lines are.
Mm. Well, there was a time, I guess, from, say, when the Berlin Wall fell down, that the West thought, right, we've sorted it all out. Everyone can become like us, and everything's going to be fine.
The end of history, remember that? End.
But in your book, things aren't as fine as we might think.
Stan, I'm not sure why you're on mute. I'm not sure why, darling. I'm trying to get you off.
Am I back?
You're back.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, look, Mark, that tantalizing idea of the end of history. Again, a Hegelian idea. Francis Fukuyama, the American political scientist, wrote in 1989 with the falling of the Berlin Wall that we had reached the end of history, that the ideological struggles had been fought and won, and that liberal democracy, in his view, was the last hope of mankind standing, that this was the universal truth, that liberalism had vanquished all other comers. And of course, that wasn't true. In the same year, 1989, we saw the Tiananmen Square massacre, when Deng Xiaoping orders his People's Liberation Army to gun down their own people. When Deng Xiaoping says that communism will not die, but we will double down on the idea of the Chinese Communist Party while opening up to market liberalism. I go back a little bit earlier from 1989 too, and I look at 1979 as a critical period, Mark, where a lot of the fault lines of our world started to be formed. I was just coming into the last years of my high school. I was coming of age. as a young man who'd grown up in the shadow of nuclear holocaust, in the fears of the Cold War. And in 1979, we see the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which presages the ultimate collapse of the Soviet empire, the rise of the Taliban, and of course, with bin Laden and the Mujahideen going to join the fight against the Soviets, the rise of Al-Qaeda. And from there, of course, we see ultimately the events of 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which sets fire to the Muslim world in this idea of a resurgent Islamism. Margaret Thatcher coming to power in Great Britain and the beginnings of a neoliberal revolution, that she would join forces with Ronald Reagan, who would come to power a couple of years later. And in 1979, a young Mikhail Gorbachev goes to London and has a 5-hour meeting with Margaret Thatcher and goes back and begins the reforms that ultimately would see the breakup of the Soviet Empire. So, this idea that we are on a trajectory towards some end of history had its roots earlier and reached its zenith in 1989. But as I argue in the book, history was being remade and history was returning. And it was returning right then in that same year in China. And of course, we look at where that has led us to this deep inflection point in our world today between a resurgent authoritarianism and a waning or weakening liberalism.
Yes, that's really interesting. Next, in your book, you spend quite a lot of time, or I think 2 or 3 chapters on China. And I found it a very sort of illuminating sort of little potted history of China and the trajectory of China since the revolution and the events leading up to it. Can you explain why China has become what it's like now? I mean, we thought, there was a time, wasn't it? We thought that when they were getting their Apple Watches and
they'd become like us.
They would become like us.
Yeah.
And I went to China once and to visit some bookshops, and there were English language books and everything seemed terribly open, but underneath it, it's not, is it?
Well, it was always this balancing act, wasn't it, between embracing those parts of the West that China believed would aid its own rehabilitation, enrich the country, return China to power, while in the Communist Party's view, not destabilizing the political system, not leading to the demise of the party itself. Now, of course, you're right. A lot of people in the West and Western political leaders like Bill Clinton, who lectured the Chinese that they were on the wrong side of history. Others who said that the Communist Party in China would collapse and go the way of the Soviet Union. It has defied all of those predictions. I think it's rooted in something much deeper too, Mark. I think, and I do trace this in the book, China for me is really at that hinge point between the universalism of, the universal ideas of Western liberalism and democracy and the blowback against that. And it starts a lot earlier than 1989 or 1979. I think for the fall of the Qing Empire at the end of the 19th century really ushered in a dark night of the soul for China. It had lost its place in the world, vanquished by Britain in the Opium Wars. It had lost territory like Hong Kong. It had tipped the country into catastrophic conflict and civil war, revolution. There were Chinese leaders and thinkers asking a question: what is it to be Chinese now? What do we take of the West? How have we been so weakened? How did we become so feeble and morally corrupt and inept that we could be usurped in this way? Were we not the center of the universe? What is it to be China? And I suppose that then leads to the communist revolution and Mao Zedong standing in Tiananmen Square in 1949 and saying the Chinese people have stood up. And today you hear the legacy of that in the refrain, the endless refrain of the history of humiliation, the century of humiliation, how China had been dominated and humiliated by foreign powers. from the British to the Germans to the French to the Americans to the Japanese, and how this will never happen again. And I think that sense of historical resentment and vengeance we don't appreciate enough in the West, but it powers the idea of what China is in the world today. And being an Aboriginal person, that resonated with me because I come from that history of humiliation and domination too. And I could see something of myself in that. And it was, I think, something that we have not written or thought about enough. And in focusing on that in those chapters, I try to show how that hinge point of history is now reshaping our lives today, and even in influencing things such as Islamist terrorism, ISIS, Al Qaeda, the Taliban, certainly states like North Korea. I think China and the legacy of that history and the festering resentment against Western domination and humiliation is something we need to be very cognizant of.
Yeah, I'm interested you talk about North Korea there, that you've visited there a few times, and I think you were there when Kim Jong was made his first appearance as supreme leader. They haven't followed that that path, have they? The economic liberalism, I guess.
They've put their toe in the water. There've been attempts at various times, especially around the demilitarized zone, the 38th parallel between North and South Korea, to develop these economic free zones, but they've never really gathered enough sort of momentum. And I think there's a again, in North Korea, the party comes first, or the Kim family comes first, the regime comes first. And there's a fear amongst them, I suppose, that if there was economic reform, and there is economic change and economic reform, it's a wealthier country today than it was 20 years ago. But it's, again, that tension between reform, but also doubling down on the authoritarian, autocratic nature of the regime itself, and often brutally doubling down on that as well. It's a fascinating country to go to because you do enter a time warp. I remember having a conversation with a man there one day who was my minder. Wherever you go there, you're attached to a minder who watches everything that you do. And over time, a few weeks will go by, you become reasonably friendly and casual with each other, and you've shared a few meals and spoken about your families and dropped your guard a little bit. And I asked him he was a musician, a great music fan, and I asked him about the Beatles, and he'd never heard of them. And you realise in those moments that this is an entirely different place, so sealed off, so cut off from the rest of the world, a place of great suffering, but also a place that is eternally at war. It is still fighting the Korean War. It has never ended. And you're right, I was there when Kim Jong-un was introduced as the new leader after his father, Kim Jong-il, had passed away. And I was standing amongst a sea of soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers. And I would have been 100 meters from the stage, and he walked out, and they heard his voice for the very first time. This young man, still in his 20s, now ascending to leadership as the third generation of the Kim family to rule the country, and facing the reality that this man commands a nuclear arsenal. It is a paranoid, secretive regime, and yet there are people there living real lives of love and hope and joy and dignity against enormous odds and with none of the freedoms that we enjoy. And to be there and to be cognizant of that and to try to make sense of that was a remarkable thing.
And going back to China, the Korean War is still very important to China, isn't it? Because it was a great victory for them.
Yes,
but we in the West, or especially America, has tried to flush that under the carpet.
It's the forgotten war in the West. We never talk about Korea, and it is called the forgotten war in the United States. In China, of course, it's not even called the Korean War. It's called the War of Resistance against American aggression. And there was a pivotal battle in the Korean War. And think about this. 1945, World War II ends and America is ascendant. We enter into the American century. America emerges then as the great power, the great hegemon. Douglas MacArthur, who'd been victorious in the Pacific Theatre, is now in control of American forces and UN forces in Korea. North Korea makes a move on the south and it then tips the entire peninsula over into conflict. And it becomes one of the first conflicts of the new Cold War. Russia supporting the North and China supporting North Korea, and of course the Western forces supporting South Korea. Douglas MacArthur, full of his hubris and his triumphalism of the victory in World War II, says, I can finish this war by Christmas. I will march my troops to the 38th parallel and straight through to Pyongyang. Little does he realise that Mao Zedong, who is battle-hardened, who has fought decades of conflict, and just in 1949, the year before the beginning of the Korean War, stands there and crowns the victory in the Communist Revolution. He moves 300,000 of his troops, 300,000, up onto the border, up onto the 38th parallel, and he outflanks MacArthur. And he outsmarts MacArthur. And MacArthur walks into a trap. And the might of the American 8th Army is crushed, and it precipitates what is still today the single biggest retreat in American military history. China celebrates that every year. The old soldiers who've now passed on would march down the street with their medals like we do in Anzac Day. And it was commemorated as a great moment where they vanquished the United States. Xi Jinping has now turned that into a rallying cry for Chinese nationalism as they stare down America today amidst, again, real fear and concern of a potential great power conflict between the US and China. The Korean War is absolutely at the hinge point of this new history, this new emerging great power rivalry that we're seeing.
It's really interesting. We see that China, Xi Jinping, is flexing its muscles much more, asserting its right, I suppose, as you're saying, trying to correct the historical injustices. We see in Hong Kong, what was promised was 50 years of a Western-style democracy is now, that's not so true anymore. We see military planes flying over Taiwan. What's the play there?
Well, Mark, I stood on the border in 1997 in the driving rain up on the border of the new territories of Hong Kong and the mainland China. And I saw the People's Liberation Army come across that border, rows and rows of armoured personnel carriers and trucks, and the might of the Chinese army, hand-picked, the tallest, most defiant soldiers. And they came back to take something that was theirs. And it really marked a return of history. We were always going to get to this moment. As China became more powerful, more economically secure, as it built its military, as it defied all the predictions of collapse, we were going to reach a moment where it would be in a position to directly challenge what we see as a liberal global order. And Xi Jinping has accelerated that. He is finishing the revolution. What Mao started, Deng Xiaoping built, he will finish. The China dream, the rejuvenation of the nation. And that means reunifying Taiwan with the mainland at any cost, in his words. It means crushing dissent and democracy in Hong Kong and making Hong Kong part of China. It means harmonising, this phrase that he uses, harmonising the nation. Anyone who sings out of tune, if you like, is locked up. That means Uyghur Muslims. That means Tibetans. That means dissidents, lawyers, poets, activists, journalists, writers. At the same time, he is delivering on the promise to the Chinese people of economic success, lifting people out of poverty, empowering the nation, rejuvenating the nation, returning the nation to as he sees it, its rightful place. And, you know, the rise of big powers is destabilizing. The rise of Britain after the Industrial Revolution was enormously destabilizing and violent. Of course, you know, Australia is a creation of that. The rise of the United States as a great power was incredibly destabilizing. And the things that we accuse China of today were committed by those nations of taking land, oppressing peoples. The United States annexed Hawaii illegally. It expanded its own territory, its own reach. Now, all of those empires arguably also brought incredible progress and achievement. You know, the computer age, putting people on the moon, technology, modern capitalism, incredible wealth, all of those things, but there's also a downside. And I think we're seeing this with China too, an abuse of human rights, a brutality and an authoritarianism that also goes hand in hand with the nation that is the biggest engine of economic growth in the world, and without whom Australia's prosperity would be put at peril. And we have to navigate this. We have to navigate all of this. The threat of China, the indispensable nature of the Chinese nation, its importance to our economy, the worst excesses of human rights abuses. And we have to manage all of that. And that makes this a particularly dangerous age. It is a flashpoint.
It's very difficult, as you point out, because I think you made a comment somewhere that the difference, say, between the Cold War, where Russia and the West were, you know, there was an Iron Curtain, but here we're much more connected.
Yes.
It's, even though we may not like what China's doing to its citizens, to the Uyghurs, the whole world relies on that free flow of information and goods and technologies between these worlds.
Yeah. You know, we just go back to that point you made earlier, that we always thought they'd become like us, and we comforted ourselves in that notion and that post-1989 hubris that liberal democracy was a universal good, and ultimately, as people became rich, they would seek their freedom and no oppressive regime would be able to stand astride history and deny people their freedom. And we've seen that is not the case. And I think that has really dawned on us. It has created a sense of panic, I suppose, right now amongst Western nations, and Australia is really caught in the crosshairs of that. The United States, which had seen China as a cooperative partner, now sees it as a competitor, if not an outright threat. And in its 2017 National Strategic Outlook, identified China as the single biggest threat to the United States, followed by Russia, and even greater than terrorism. And Australia, that idea that we didn't have to choose between our strategic partner, the United States, and our economic partner, China, I think we now see as folly. Of course, we have to choose, and we have made those choices and very much aligned ourselves with the United States, which inevitably we were going to do, but that's coming at a cost. There are consequences. You know, we are losing jobs and we are losing business because of that. It is a very difficult thing to navigate, and unfortunately, at a time when we are seeking to negotiate this clash of authoritarianism and liberal democracy itself is under siege. And Freedom House, which measures the health of democracies in the world, now counts 15 straight years of declining democracy and freedom. We know that democracies have been held hostage to autocrats and demagogues and populist figures. We saw the storming of the Capitol building in the United States and 4 years of Donald Trump, and gross inequalities in democracies, a weakening of the institutions of democracy. In Australia, we've seen royal commissions into our churches and our banks and our aged care institutions, and the loss of faith in government, people turning away from government. All of these things are happening within liberal democracy at a time when there is a viable, stable alternative, albeit a brutal one, with an authoritarian China. So you know, we are living through a critical period of history, which may only be commensurate with that drift to war, I suppose, in 1914, when people kept saying, you know, the world is so interconnected. Germany and England are each other's biggest trading partners. The Kaiser and the King are cousins. This cannot happen. This cannot happen. Oh my God, it's happened. And that's what a lot of people fear now.
Do you think the Chinese people, will they put up with this heavy-handed regime, or is it a fragile construct?
It's all of that, Mark. It is incredibly strong, and it's also incredibly weak. Susan Shirk, who's a sinologist, a great China watcher from the United States, about a decade or so ago, wrote a book that coined the term the fragile superpower. In many respects, that's what China is, and the Communist Party is afraid of its own shadow. The history of China tells you what happens when the people stand up and revolt. I mean, of the 5 deadliest conflicts in human history, 3 of them happened in China, and they all happened in the last stages of the 19th century into the 20th century, in modern times. They know what happens when people revolt. But one of the things the Communist Party has managed to do is to co-opt the people in the project of the rejuvenation of the nation. The promise to make people rich, to lift people out of poverty, they have delivered upon. And if you are, you know, and I write about this in the book, you know, if you've seen your life transformed, if you now live in a nice home with running water and electricity, and your kids are going to a good school, and, you know, there are great infrastructure and amenities and facilities, and you're seeing your country powerful again, a nation that couldn't feed itself in our lifetimes, that lived through enormous famine and revolution, and now you have stability and prosperity. They are very seductive things. And it's a different definition of freedom in some respects. It's not a Western liberal individualist idea of freedom, but it is a freedom to live a life without hunger, without want, with a future. And while ever the Communist Party can deliver that, it is able to hold those other impulses for freedom and democracy in check. But where those things fray, if the economy does go into free fall, if people who are very angry about a lot of things in China, notwithstanding the economic growth, there is still a lot of anger about environmental degradation and corruption. There's lots of things that people are angry about. If the economy started to spiral, many of those other fractures, I think, would become much more apparent. And that's where the fragility of the party lies. It has to, you know, it's like the Wizard of Oz. It's the little man behind the big microphone. Whatever you believe in the big sounding voice, then you'll stay in power. But if things go wrong and people see what's really behind the voice, then we know where that leads in China.
What's interesting, if I could go back to earlier, you referred to 1979 as a rather pivotal year, and particularly the Iranian Revolution and also the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union, which led to the birth of Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorism. You worked a lot in those areas. Can you tell us a bit about some of those experiences and how you think they're playing out now in the world?
And Mark, again, it's sort of understanding what the roots of this are. You know, there's a narrative in the media that was very simplistic, but very persuasive, that somehow this was a throwback to some 8th or 9th century medieval brutality or a crusade. No, this Islamist terrorism is a very modern movement. Like the collapse of the Qing Empire gave rise to that deep inflection in China that led ultimately to the Communist Revolution, the fall of the Ottoman Empire led to the same introspection in the Islamic world. How could the Muslim world be so weak that it could be overthrown, that the caliphate could fall? Who are we? What does it mean to be Islamic? the Muslim world toyed with nationalism and socialism and democracy, and all the while there were those who were bringing into life this idea of what it was to be Muslim. An Islamist political movement began with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but then ultimately morphs into more increasingly violent or radical manifestations of that. But it is a very modern thing. Of course, after the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets, it becomes a rallying cry there. It brings in fighters from far afield, from Africa, from the Middle East, who go there to join in that struggle. And of course, America, as part of this Cold War proxy battle in Afghanistan, was pumping money through Pakistan to aid the fight against the Soviets. At the same time, in Pakistan, there is a resurgence of Islamism there, and they start to build these madrasas, these Islamic schools with Saudi money and Iranian money and American money. And out of those schools emerged the Taliban, who are, the Taliban literally means the scholars. They were the students, and they take power in Afghanistan. And so when I arrived there after the attack in 9/11, and I'm covering the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, it becomes very apparent to me that just like China, this is something deep-seated. This is a blowback against the West. There are deep memories of humiliation here. They are fighting memories of the Crusade. That's part of the rhetoric. They are fighting against what they see as the oppression of the West after the First World War, the carving up of the Middle East, new borders drawn, despots supported and propped up by liberal democratic regimes. And people like bin Laden sort of tap into that resentment, marry it to this idea of a religious fundamentalism and weaponize that. It was when I was there reporting, I wanted to make sense of that. I wanted to see how all of these things connected. And of course, reporting the absolute brutality of it, walking through marketplaces that are bombed out, watching mothers picking bits of burning flesh out of shell holes in the walls after bombings because it's all they've got left of their children to bury. To see war and know that war is real. It is not something that's abstract. It's not something we watch in a film. It happens, and it can happen in places that were previously secure, and that these things are horrific. So reporting these things, you're being immersed in these things, while at the same time, because I am who I am, because I am a person who looks at the world through my eyes and my history, trying to make sense of it, trying to see what it looks like through other people's eyes.
You actually interviewed quite a high-up Taliban leader. I think you don't reveal his name, but...
Yeah, well, a very scary proposition this was because, everyone knows the memories of what happened to someone like Daniel Pearl from the Wall Street Journal who'd gone off to interview, militants and was murdered. People who were kidnapped and beheaded by some of these organisations. When I was working out of Pakistan, we would quite regularly be in contact with the Taliban. They're a big organisation. They have their own media teams. They send out press releases. Literally, they call you on the phone and tell you, they want to pass on messages or do interviews. But there was a period there that was a particularly violent, brutal period. And the Pakistani Taliban was becoming, even to the Afghan Taliban, unhinged. And Mullah Omar, the supreme leader of the Taliban, had sent one of his lieutenants to read the Riot Act to the Pakistani Taliban. Now, the man that he sent had been involved in a big siege at the Red Mosque in Islamabad and had fled and was among the most wanted men, if not the most wanted man at that time in Pakistan. And he'd come back across the border to read the Riot Act to the Pakistani Taliban and say, listen, stop killing Pakistani people, stop killing civilians, kill as many Westerners as you like, but we need to impose some order here or we're going to lose the people. And through our intermediary, we had organised to do an interview with this man. Now, that meant that, he had a message. He wanted to get out to the world. He wanted to speak to CNN that I was working for. But that meant going into Taliban territory. It meant surrendering our security to the Taliban. And it was harrowing, I've got to tell you, to take that journey, to go into that territory, to know that our fate was in their hands, to do this interview and hope that we would get out alive, knowing that others had not. But these are the decisions that have to be made. I was not there to not do these stories. If I was afraid to do those stories, I wouldn't have gone there. And we have to understand what the world looks like through others' eyes. And so, these are decisions we had to make all the time, weighing up the risks versus the importance of the story, and sometimes putting yourself into the hands of people that we know could kill and had killed.
So in your book, you devote a chapter to evil.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by evil.
When you met this sheep, did you see evil or?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by evil because, we've turned evil into something that, into a Hollywood film. We turn the devil into some sort of cloven hoofed figure with horns that scares children into obedience, or, it's something you learn about in Sunday school. And we forget that evil can be very, as Hannah Arendt said, very banal, very human, very ordinary, and in fact, very seductive. What was the power of the evil of the Nazi regime that could co-opt its own population, its own people with children, mothers and fathers who loved and went to work and enjoyed music and had joy and dignity in their lives, but acquiesced to the most barbarous brutality. We can surrender so easily to evil, and we can convince ourselves that it's not real and it doesn't exist because evil can make sense to us. It can make us believe in ourselves. It can touch a part of ourselves that only evil knows it can touch, where we are most susceptible. And I came face to face with this up on the Afghan-Pakistan border when I was traveling with Pakistani military in the fight along the border, and they had arrested and captured a man whose job it was to train suicide bombers. Now you think about this. This is someone whose job it was to train people to kill and kill themselves in the process. And when I came face to face with him and was interviewing him, I was struck by not how repellent or repugnant this man was, but how incredibly seductive and powerful he was, how humble and gentle he was. He had a voice like honey. He had this aura and this saintly demeanor, and yet he was capable of such evil. And I could imagine what it would be like for a young, susceptible person or someone who'd been kidnapped, brainwashed into this, to fall prey to this man because he was, in so many ways, this seductive, quite arresting, beautiful figure. And you could imagine him getting into people's minds and getting them to do these horrendous things. And I was with my cameraman, who I'd worked with a lot, and he was an Iraqi man, and a man who had seen his father had been murdered by the Saddam regime. He'd reported and filmed the worst of the conflicts in Iraq. He and I had seen a lot of bad things. And when we were getting on the helicopter to come back to Islamabad, he turned to me and he said, "Did you think that man had the most beautiful voice you've ever heard?" And I said, "Yes, I did." There was something about him that was both evil and incredibly seductive. And we need to be aware of that. Sometimes evil takes guises that can convince us it's either not real or that it is incredibly virtuous. And that's where it's dangerous.
I'm mindful that we haven't got much longer, but I really want to get, it seems to me the central thesis of your book is that our liberal democracies are very fragile at the moment.
Yeah.
For a number of reasons. Obviously from the weaknesses of their historical past and the things they've done to other cultures. But you seem to imply that they're on the wane. And
yeah,
where
I think the evidence, Mark. I think the evidence, Mark, is that obviously democracy is on the wane. There are fewer democratic states today than there were last year or the year before or the year before that. And the very home of democracy, the bastion of democracy, that Enlightenment nation, the United States, which had held itself up as the beacon of democracy, the city on the hill, as they called it, is tearing itself apart, almost ungovernable. It comes at a time when we see this rising authoritarian, very stable challenge to that democratic liberal order from China. And, I think, liberalism's success in creating a world where the rights of the individual are paramount, creating a world of endless growth and progress, of capitalism, of globalization, also has a downside. It breeds alienation. It breeds deep inequalities that erode the civic, that civic courtesy that is required for us to live in a democracy. I think coronavirus has exposed a lot of this. When the United States, the richest country in the world, as I say, a country that has presented itself as the bastion of democracy, has been laid low by this virus because of its own ineptitude, its failure to govern effectively. And the people who are most affected by this are the poor and the black, the people who have been left behind in this country, who no longer believe in the American dream. And I don't say this as someone who relishes or welcomes the collapse of liberalism. Far from it. I wrestle with it because I see that it was imported in the cargo of colony and empire and genocide. Liberal democracy has a deeply troubling history. And yet there is something within that idea that offers us the hope of freedom or the hope of liberty or the hope of being able to rule, being able to govern over our differences in a way that doesn't erase our differences, but turns those things into a virtue, something that we share. It's that struggle with the soul of democracy and liberalism, I think, that we are living through right now. And if China usurps the West, whatever you want to call the West, it won't necessarily be because China is more dominant or more powerful, but because the West has failed its own promise. And we're seeing that. We are seeing that every single day. I think the belief in a universal liberalism, that it is like, it's the laws of liberal democracy are as permanent as the laws of physics, that this is a natural order of things. I think we've realised that that is not true. So what do we do with this right now? How do we strengthen those things that are dear to us? How do we redeem liberalism from its tragic legacy of racism and sexism and violence in the face of this real challenge by a rising authoritarianism? It is really the story of the age, and you're right, it's the central thesis of this book. It's a journey into that darkness, I think, in the book.
Well, I don't think you've offered us any solutions yet. You've raised so many questions. It's a fascinating book. It's really provoked me and made me think about things. And all you readers out there, I really highly recommend it. It's going to make you think about things that you've always held dear. I was a baby boomer that saw the sort of the first of the social revolutions, thinking our generation would make the world a better place, but we sure have failed in that. And Stan, thank you so much for this book. It's been such a thought-provoking.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for giving your time to discuss it with us.
It's been a real pleasure, Mark. Thank you so much. And you're right. It's not a book that necessarily seeks to answer the problems. It's a book that seeks to reveal these issues and to make us ask deeper questions. And if there is a redeeming thing in the book, it isn't the promise of hope, which we know so often can be a mirage and can be used by politicians to make us believe in something that isn't really there. But if there is something redeeming, it is in the ordinary stories of people. It is in that incredible human spirit that I've seen in the worst places, facing the greatest adversity. And I snatch those moments of what it is to be alive, to redeem myself against the horrors of so many of the things I've written and seen, written about and seen. So, yeah, thank you so much for being able to share this, and thank you to everybody who has tuned in. And I hope you get something out of the book, and I hope it makes you think, and I hope it makes you cherish the things that we should hold dear in our own lives.
Thank you, Stan. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And good luck. And you've got another book coming out very shortly, which is amazing.
Look, I only have a certain number of years left on this planet, and I want to fill it with as much writing as I can. So I've got a book on Tom Keneally coming.
And we're very fortunate that you're going to come in person to talk about that one with Christos Chalkis. So that'll be a wonderful night. All you people out there, keep an eye out for that announcement. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you once again, Stan. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Remember, we're in that readings bookshop, everybody. Remember, we're right down the back there. And everybody is applauding so loudly, so hopefully. To you, Stan, thank you for your time. And to you, Mark, thank you. To everyone out there, do keep reading. Do keep thinking. Good night. See you next time.